Hello everyone and welcome to your first ever lesson on the game of chess. To start with the game of chess, we have to understand where it came from. The game started back about 1500 years ago where each piece mimicked 4 divisions of the military. Now we come to see these pieces as pawns, rooks, knights, bishops, king, and queen. Now the first thing you want to know in chess is how to set up the board. Now you set up the board the following way, just as it's set up in the live demonstration board and on the virtual board. We have our rook in the corner, which is on the h1 square, and the bottom right square should be a light colored square. Now your queen should be on its color, so the queen should be on d1 and the opposing queen should be opposite the queen. I see a lot of people putting the queen over here where it belongs on its color. So if the queen's on its color, you know it's on the right square. The bishop is next to the queen, the knight is next to the bishop, and the rooks are on the edge of the board. And the pawns are neatly laid out on the 2nd and 7th ranks. Now first we're starting off with the rook's movement. The rook is the piece that starts on the edge of the board and it moves straight and horizontal. And remember, a rook can capture an enemy piece, but it can't go through an enemy piece and it can't capture its own piece. So for example, the rook could come to this square in this position. It could also come to h7 and capture the pawn. But from this position, it couldn't go to a7 because there's a pawn in the way. Now it can also come to this square where the rook can actually grab the pawn. And let's say your opponent makes a random move, you will simply grab the pawn. So that is how the rook moves in a nutshell. Now let's move on to the bishop. The bishop is a piece that moves diagonally in every direction. For example, it can come to this square, a2. It can also come to this square and pick up the pawn, the same thing with the rook. But guess what it can't do? If they play a random move with the king, of course we'll get to the king and pawn movements later, we can't take this pawn because it's covered via our pawn, so we can't take it. So that is the bishop. It just goes diagonally any way you want. Moving on to the queen. Now the queen's a piece where it goes vertically and horizontally like a rook, and it goes diagonally like a bishop, so it's the combination of both pieces. So for example, we could take this pawn. But similarly to the rook and bishop, it can't travel through pieces. So it can't travel through our own pieces, so we won't be able to actually pick up this pawn. So the queen could also come here. The queen could also come here, but this wouldn't be a very good move in chess because the king would take you. The queen could also come to a square like this. So that's basically how the queen moves, vertically and diagonally. So if you have a board in front of you, I really want you to practice this, the rook, bishop, and queen's movement before moving on to the next part of the video. Next, we're going on to the knight's movement. The knight is probably the most tricky piece in chess and it moves in an L shape. What do I mean by move in an L shape? It goes 2 squares up and 1 across. And it can also go 2 squares across and 1 up. So in this position, the knight could go to this square, it could go to this square, it could go to this square, this square, this square. And if you're thinking this is really complicated, it is at the start, but when you start getting used to it, you will know everywhere the knight can go. And the knight can also go backwards. So remember that with all the pieces, they can go backwards, except the pawns. We'll get to that later. So the knight can simply take this pawn, and let's say they play a random move with the king, we could also take this pawn. And the knight is a piece that can actually jump over pieces. So just remember that the knight is kind of like a horse, it can gallop over pieces. So in this position, you might think, okay, I can't travel here, just the same way a rook or a bishop might not be able to travel, but the knight actually can jump over pieces. So the knight is special in that way. So now if you have a board in front of you, I really want you to practice how the knight moves, move it around a few squares, see what you can do, and just have fun with it. Now we're moving on to the pawn's movement. So at the start of the game, the pawn can always move 2 squares or 1 square up. When the white pawns are on the 2nd rank and the black pawns are on the 7th rank, they can move 2 up or 1 up. So for example, in this position, we can move the pawn 2 up, or we can move the pawn 1 up. It's up to us. But every subsequent move after that, we can only move it 1 up. Now, one more thing about the pawn, they don't capture vertically. For example, this pawn cannot capture our pawn because pawns only capture diagonally. So for example, this pawn can either move up or it can capture our pawn. But for us, we can't capture this pawn. These pawns are kind of blocking each other, so they can't do anything here. So the pawn captures diagonally, but moves vertically. And one thing with the pawn, it can never go backwards or to the side. So the pawn doesn't go backwards or to the side. One more thing about the pawn is if you get a pawn to the end of the board, it can become any piece you want. So you can make it a knight, a rook, a bishop, or a queen. In this case, I would make it a queen and proceed to win the game, since the queen is very powerful and you'll pick up all of your opponent's pawns. Now I want you to practice how the pawn moves, try promoting the pawn, try capturing with the pawn, and now I want to move on to some special rules. The first special move comes with the pawn. So of course the pawn can capture. Let's say he plays the move like this. A6, we can capture the pawn like we did before. But even if he played the move A5, we could also take the pawn. But this seems really weird. What's going on here? Well, there's a rule in chess called en passant. If there's a pawn on the 5th rank and black tries to push the pawn to the 5th rank so that we can't take it, we can actually take it via en passant. And this rule was invented because people didn't like the fact that, okay, if I push this pawn, I can't take it. They didn't like that the pawn could just run down, so they invented this rule called en passant. Yes, I know it's weird, but yes, it does exist, and you do need to know this rule. So, for example, if they played this move, similarly, we could take it like this. And the same thing applies with the black pieces in reverse. So with the black pieces, the pawns would be on the 4th rank, and the same thing would apply. So just as an example, let's say they play this move. Now let's say we move the king back. Let's say they play this move. Now we give this check. Now they could take with the king, but they can also take with the pawn because that's en passant. So with en passant, I really want you to practice this one. Go ahead, set this up on a board and try and practice the rule en passant. You might not get it right the first time. And as we progress through chess, we'll teach you how to do it properly in all situations. Now, here's the king. The king is very simple. It goes one square in any direction it wants. So in this position, it could go one square to any single direction it wants. For example, it can come here. Let's say they play a random move, we can come one square. A random move, we can go one square. So this is how the king moves. The king is a very simple piece. There's one more thing I want you to know about the king. The king can never stand opposite the opponent's king, meaning the king can never come to this square. The kings can never be close to each other because if they are, the enemy king would take you. So it's illegal in chess to actually put your kings next to each other. So practice moving the king around, try taking stuff with the king. The king can capture like any other piece. And yes, try and move the king around on your chessboard. Now moving on to another special rule called castling. And this is the last special rule we're going to cover. So castling is what happens when you clear out the pieces. So you move your knight away. Let's say you move your bishop away at the start of the game. So I'll demonstrate this on the board as well. Now what you can do then is castle the king. So the king can be moved to safety via castling kingside, where the king comes on g1 and the rook comes on f1. Or castling queenside, where the king comes on c1 and the rook comes on d1. Similarly, black can also castle the king to either side of the board, the queen side or the king side. Castling helps because it brings your king to safety in a lot of situations, but there's certain exceptions of when you can and can't castle. So let's go through them right now. So number one, if you move the rook on the side you want to castle to, you're not able to castle to that side. So I wouldn't be able to castle to the queen side there. Neither would black, but I can castle to the king side here, because I haven't moved the rook and I'm able to castle to that side of the board. Now moving on to castling rule number 2, if your king is in check, you are not allowed to castle. In any way, shape or form, you can't castle if your king is actively being hit. So you can't castle out of check. And number 3, you can't castle if your king would pass through check during the castling. This one's a complex one and one I didn't grasp for a long time, so don't worry if you think it's too complicated. It's something I just need to mention because it is a rule. But basically what it is, if a bishop is controlling a square that your king would have to go to when it's castling, it would have to go to f1 and g1, you are not allowed to castle because something is in the way and your king would be under fire when you are castling. So that is also the third castling rule that we have to keep track of. Now, just to demonstrate how castling could occur in a game, let's say after e4, e5, just a standard opening, bring your knights out. Let's say the bishop comes out. Let's say the bishop comes out. We can simply castle here with no qualms, and this is a really good position. Now the game could just proceed, and the king is safely castled in this position, and the black king could also safely castle. I would definitely urge you to castle the king on your own, on the king side and queen side. You can just move the pieces around and see what happens. And of course, you might not get it perfectly the first time, but slowly and surely, we're going to build upon these rules. Now let's go to the aim of the game. The aim of the game is to checkmate the enemy king. So in this example, we're looking for checkmate. And checkmate occurs when you're in check and your king has no more legal moves and it can't do anything else. So for example, in this position, black can checkmate the white king by playing this rook down here, where the rook attacks the king. And since the king can only move one square in every direction, even if it moves up, the other rook would be attacking the king. So it would be simply checkmate. Now there are 3 ways you can get out of a checkmate. The 3 ways to get out of a checkmate are to capture the attacking piece. For example, let's say we had a queen over here, we could take the rook and it wouldn't be checkmate. Number 2 is to block the piece that's giving a check. Let's say we had a knight over here, we could move the knight back and the knight would be blocking the checkmate from the rook. Rule number 3 is to move the king away. The most simplest rule, but here the rook clearly blocks our path, so we can't move the king away in this case. But it's always important to know the ways we can defend against the checkmate. Now here we're looking at draw via stalemate. So stalemate occurs, so in chess there's a thing that occurs which is called stalemate. It happens when your king has no legal moves, but it's also not in check. If you see the example prior, our king was in check. But in this example, the queen is simply on the square. It's not attacking the king, but our king has no more moves and we have no more pieces. So we can't actually move anything and the game is actually a draw. It might seem counterintuitive that, okay, the king is trapped, but it's a draw. Well, it's a rule that exists in chess that if your king is not attacked and it's not in check, the game is a draw. But for example, if we had a pawn over here, we could push the pawn and the game wouldn't be a draw because we do have a legal move available. Now this is demonstrating that point. If the queen comes here, now we have a pawn. Now we can push the pawn and actually it's not a draw. They would simply bring the queen back and try and checkmate us with the king and the queen. Let's go to the next rule, which is draw via insufficient material. So this occurs when, let's say the queen is sacrificed here. This would be insufficient material as we can't checkmate the kings with kings alone. That's not even possible. The same thing goes for if we had a knight on either side or a bishop on either side, but not both together. So let's say there's just a knight and a king. It would be a draw because you can't just checkmate with a knight and a king. The same thing goes for a bishop and a king. Now with a rook and a king, you can checkmate. With a queen and a king, you can checkmate. And you actually can checkmate with a bishop and knight, but you can't checkmate with 2 knights. So it's a bit complex and you don't need to know this. So it's a bit complex and you don't need to know all of this right now, but it's good that you're getting a grasp on when it's insufficient material and when can we actually checkmate the king. You can also have a draw via 3-fold repetition. So for example, this position is the first time this has occurred. Now, this is the second time this has occurred with a knight on f3 and a knight on g8. And this is the third time this has occurred with a knight on f3 and a knight on g8. This would actually be able to be claimed as a draw. It's not a draw immediately, you would have to call the arbiter, but it is actually a draw. So this is one thing you have to know. If you repeat the position, the game can also be a draw. So that's it. The pawns can either move 1 or 2 squares on the first go. The knights move in an L shape. The bishop moves diagonally. The king is able to castle. The rook moves horizontally or vertically. Of course, it can't go through the pawn, so it can only go here in this position. And the queen moves any square it wants to, where it's not capturing its own pieces, of course. Just remember the en passant rule, which occurs of, let's say they play some move like this, and if we play this move b4, they can actually capture this. And it only occurs on that rank. That's the special rule you do want to keep track of, but that's about it. That is the game of chess, and have fun with playing your chess games. You might need to watch this twice over, but that's okay. If you grasp the rules now, you never forget them, and you'll be able to play chess for however long you like, correctly following the rules.